Hello, my friends. My name is Tom. Welcome back to King English Podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something that's often in the news, but not always easy to understand. Have you ever seen a headline saying the government is spending billions on something strange while the country is buried in debt? People get angry. They get worried. But did you know that almost every country in the world is in debt? It's true. India has debt. Germany has debt. Even Switzerland and Qatar have debt. Even the richest nations are not free from it. Japan owes twice as much as its entire economy produces. The United States. It has around $36 trillion in debt, and the number keeps growing. That sounds unbelievable. So, you might be wondering, why are countries in debt? Why don't they just print more money? Is debt really that bad? And if countries borrow money, who are they borrowing it from? Can a country ever be completely debt-free? In this episode, we'll answer all of these questions and more. Let's start with the basics. So, what is national debt? When we talk about a country owing money, we call it national debt. It's also known as public debt, government debt, or sovereign debt. It means the total amount of money that a central or federal government owes. Just like you or I might take out a loan when we need extra cash. Governments also borrow money when their spending is more than what they earn from taxes and other income. But unlike us borrowing from one bank, governments borrow from many different places. They can borrow from other countries, large financial institutions, or even their own people. It's important to understand that national debt only includes debt from the central government. In the United States, for example, national debt includes only the federal government's debt. It does not include debts from state governments like California or Texas. It also doesn't include personal debt like student loans, credit card debt, or mortgages from regular American citizens. So now you know what national debt means. But the next question is, why do countries even borrow money? Why don't they just print more money? This is something many people ask. On the surface, it sounds like a quick solution. If the government needs money, why not just print it? If governments just start printing money endlessly, they may feel like they have an unlimited supply. That can lead to them spending recklessly. As more and more money floods the economy, it causes inflation. Prices start to rise quickly, and money loses its value. In extreme cases, this becomes what we call hyperinflation. This is what happened in Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Their currencies became almost worthless, and people lost trust in the government's ability to manage the economy. On the other hand, borrowing money forces governments to be more careful. When a country borrows, it also has to pay interest. That means they can't just spend without thinking. They have to plan, they have to budget, and they have to be responsible. So, borrowing, while not perfect, helps bring some discipline. If you want more on this topic, I made another video called "Why Don't We Just Print More Money?" You can check it out in the description after this one. Now, let's look at the real reasons governments borrow money. There are a few major ones. The first reason is to cover budget deficits. Most of a government's income comes from taxes, but sometimes that tax money isn't enough to cover all the government spending. When the expenses are greater than the income, it's called a budget deficit. Let's say the government collects $3 trillion in taxes, but needs $4 trillion to run schools, hospitals, and other public services. That's a $1 trillion gap. Now, the government has some choices. It could cut spending, but that usually means fewer services. That could lead to lower quality education, longer hospital wait times, and frustrated citizens. People might protest. Another option is to raise taxes, but that can also make life harder for everyone and might lead to even more protest. So, instead, the government borrows money to fill that gap. And this happens often in many countries. The second reason countries borrow is to invest in growth. Borrowing isn't always a bad thing. Think about it. Imagine a country needs new roads, better schools, and modern hospitals. But what if the government has no extra cash and doesn't want to borrow? That would mean waiting many years to save up enough money to build those things. During that time, people suffer. Roads stay broken. Children don't have proper classrooms. Healthcare systems get worse. But if the government decides to borrow and invest in those areas now, the country can grow faster. With better infrastructure, the economy gets stronger. More jobs are created. Businesses grow. And with a stronger economy, tax revenues also increase. That means the government can eventually pay back what it borrowed. The third reason is to deal with emergencies. Sometimes unexpected things happen. Wars break out. Natural disasters destroy cities. Or a global pandemic like COVID-19 hits. In these times, governments have to act fast. They need a lot of money quickly. For example, in 2020, the United States borrowed about $3.8 trillion, which was around 18% of its entire economy, just to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. That money went toward stimulus checks, unemployment aid, and business relief. Without borrowing that money, things could have gotten a lot worse for millions of people. The fourth reason is to pay off old debt. This might sound strange, but it happens all the time. Think about it like this. A country borrows money in 2010 and agrees to pay it back by 2020. but in 2020, they don't have enough money to repay. So what do? They borrow more money in 2020 to pay back the 2010 loan. This keeps happening again and again, as long as the government manages its debt well and keeps it under control. This isn't necessarily a problem, but if it gets out of hand, things can go wrong. That's what happened to Sri Lanka. In 2022, they defaulted on their $51 billion of external debt. This led to mass protests, shortages, and a major crisis. The fifth reason governments borrow money is to manage inflation and interest rates. Sometimes borrowing isn't about needing cash. It's actually used as a tool. Government can pull money out of the economy. That helps reduce inflation. On the other hand, if the economy is too slow, borrowing more and spending that money can help boost activity and create growth. Of course, these tools are more complex than they sound. But this gives you the basic idea, now that we've talked about why countries borrow money. Let's explore the next big question. Who is actually lending them all this money? Let's find out in the next part. Now that we understand why countries borrow money, the next question is, who are they borrowing it from? When a government takes on debt, it can be in the billions or even trillions of dollars. So, who has that kind of money to lend? The truth is, governments don't borrow from just one source. They borrow from three main sources: domestic lenders, foreign lenders, and their own central bank. Let's begin with domestic lenders. Many people don't realize this, but you can actually lend money to your own government. This is done through something called bonds. When you buy government bonds or treasury bills, you're giving your money to the government with the agreement that they will pay you back later with interest. In a way, it's like you're investing in your own country, in the United States. For example, American citizens can buy U.S. Treasury bonds, but it's not just individuals. Big local commercial banks, like Bank of America, also invest in bonds. Even some companies, mutual funds, and ETFs buy government bonds as part of their investment strategy. Government agencies themselves also buy bonds. This is known as intragovernmental debt. For instance, the Social Security Administration in the U.S. often uses its extra funds to purchase government bonds. Why? Because these bonds pay interest, and that interest helps provide more benefits to people who rely on social programs like Social Security. As of March 2025, around $7.3 trillion of U.S. national debt came from intragovernmental debt, which is about 20% of the total debt. Now, let's look at foreign lenders. Just like citizens and banks in a country can buy bonds, so can foreign individuals and institutions. A person in Germany, for example, can buy U.S. Treasury bonds just like an American can. Foreign commercial banks can also invest in government debt. And here's something interesting. Foreign governments themselves often invest in other countries' bonds, but they usually invest only in stable and strong economies. That's why countries like China and Japan are some of the largest holders of U.S. debt. China owns around $700 billion, and Japan owns about $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. These governments do this to earn interest on their money. And because U.S. bonds are seen as safe and reliable investments. But what happens if a country's economy is weak? Well, in that case, most foreign investors are cautious. They might not want to buy bonds from a country that might default, which means failing to pay back the money. If a country defaults, investors lose their money, and it's hard to get it back. That's why investors prefer direct loans in those situations. With direct loans, lenders can set certain rules. They might say, "We'll lend you money, but only if you follow our conditions." These loans are more controlled and can be used to make sure the money gets paid back when countries need money for big projects like building highways, schools, or energy systems. They often borrow from international development banks. These include institutions like the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank. These banks give out long-term loans for development projects. The interest rates are usually lower than what a country would get from other lenders, but the loans come with strict conditions. These conditions could include changes in policy or careful project oversight. Now, what if a country is facing a financial disaster and no one else is willing to lend to them? That's when the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, steps in. The IMF is often the lender of last resort. Unlike development banks, the IMF does not fund big construction projects. Instead, it gives emergency loans to countries to help them avoid total economic collapse. IMF loans also come with lower interest rates, but they require countries to make tough choices. A country might be required to raise taxes, cut government spending, or privatize state-owned companies. These changes can lead to public protests and sometimes make things worse before they get better. Countries like Greece, Argentina, and Indonesia have all faced economic troubles after accepting IMF loans and agreeing to their conditions. The third source of lending is the country's own central bank. In theory, a government can borrow money directly from its central bank. This is called debt monetization or monetary financing. In simple terms, the central bank prints new money and uses it to buy government bonds. But this can be risky. Even though bonds come with interest, printing new money can devalue the country's currency and lead to inflation or even hyperinflation because of this risk. Most modern countries avoid borrowing directly from their central bank. Instead, the central bank may still buy government bonds, but they do it in a more indirect way. Usually, they buy the bonds from commercial banks that already bought them earlier. The main reason they do this is to help control interest rates and manage inflation. It's not really about lending money to the government directly. I explain more about this in my inflation video, so be sure to check that out after this one. Now that we've talked about who lends money to countries, let's move on to an even more important question. Is national debt actually a bad thing? The short answer is no, not always. Debt can be either good or bad, depending on how it's used and how well a country manages it. Debt can be helpful if it is used wisely and responsibly. When a government borrows money to build infrastructure or improve public services, it can boost the economy. That helps create jobs, improve education, and increase productivity. In times of crisis, borrowing can help support families, businesses, and the economy as a whole. So, as long as the government keeps the debt at a manageable level, it can be a good thing. However, too much debt can become dangerous. If a country keeps borrowing money just to pay off old debt, it falls into what's called a debt trap. When the total debt becomes too large, a lot of money goes toward paying interest instead of funding things like healthcare, schools, or public safety. If investors start to believe that the country may not be able to pay back its debt, they lose confidence. This makes it harder for the country to borrow more money in the future. When that happens, the country's credit rating goes down. Yes, countries have credit ratings, just like people have credit scores at banks. A low credit rating means it's more difficult to borrow money. Or, if the country does get a loan, it has to pay higher interest rates. This leads to more debt, more problems, and possibly a financial crisis. If things get really bad, the country might default on its debt. That means they officially admit they can't pay it back, like what happened to Sri Lanka in 2022. Now you might ask, how much debt is too much? There isn't a simple number that works for every country, but one way economists measure it is by using the debt-to-GDP ratio. This ratio compares a country's total debt to the size of its economy. For example, if a country has a debt-to-GDP ratio of 60% and its economy is worth $100 billion, then it has $60 billion of debt. Many economists say that 60% or less is a safe level. But this is not a strict rule. Some countries go higher and still manage fine, while others struggle with less. In the United States, there is something called a debt ceiling. This is a legal limit on how much debt the federal government is allowed to take on. Once that limit is reached, the government can't borrow any more unless Congress votes to raise the ceiling. In theory, this rule is meant to keep government spending under control. But in practice, the ceiling is raised almost every time to avoid a default. So the limit doesn't do much to stop debt from growing. Now that we've covered when national debt is good or bad, the next question is, can a country ever be completely debt-free? We'll explore that in the next section. So, can a country ever be completely debt-free? In theory, yes, but in practice, it almost never happens. Let's think about it for a moment. Even when they're doing well, they often choose to keep some level of debt. Why? Because debt, when managed properly, can actually support growth. Instead of raising taxes every time there's a shortfall, a government can borrow money and spread out the cost over time. This gives the country flexibility. Also, having government bonds available provides a safe place for investors to park their money. In fact, many pension funds and retirement accounts are built on government bonds because they're seen as low risk. Some countries, like Norway, run budget surpluses and have large savings through their sovereign wealth funds. But even then, they don't always pay off all their debt. They might keep some debt on the books simply because it gives them more options or because it makes sense financially. Think about your own finances. If you have a low-interest mortgage and can invest your extra money somewhere that earns a higher return, you might choose to keep the mortgage rather than pay it off early. Governments sometimes think the same way. Now, what happens if a country can't pay back its debt? We've touched on this a bit earlier, but let's take a closer look. When a country defaults on its debt, it means it officially announces that it can't meet its debt payments. This can happen in several ways. Sometimes the country misses just one payment. Other times, it may try to restructure the debt, basically asking lenders to accept new terms, like lower payments or more time to repay. In some cases, the country might completely stop paying. A default is a big deal. It can shake global financial markets, especially if the country is large or its economy is closely connected with others. Investors lose confidence, and the country's credit rating drops like a rock. That makes it even harder and more expensive to borrow money in the future. Defaults often lead to currency crashes, inflation, unemployment, and political instability. In some cases, the country has to rely on emergency loans from international organizations like the IMF, which, as we discussed, come with strict conditions. You might be wondering, can a country just print more money to pay off its debt? It sounds simple, right? Just fire up the printing press and make the debt disappear. But it's not that easy. When a country prints too much money, its currency starts to lose value. This leads to inflation, where prices rise and the money in people's pockets buys less. If inflation gets out of control, it can turn into hyperinflation, where prices skyrocket so fast that the currency becomes practically worthless. We've seen this happen before in countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela. People were carrying around bags of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. So while printing money can temporarily relieve debt pressure, it often creates bigger problems. Let's recap what we've learned so far. National debt happens when a government spends more than it earns and borrows money to cover the difference. Governments borrow from their own citizens, foreign investors, other governments, development banks, and sometimes their own central banks. Debt can be useful when it's managed wisely. It can boost growth, help during emergencies, and support public services. But if debt grows too large or is mismanaged, it becomes a burden. High debt levels can slow down the economy, reduce investor confidence, and lead to higher taxes or cuts to important programs. In extreme cases, it can result in default and economic crisis. So, is national debt good or bad? The answer is, it depends. It depends on how the money is used, how much debt a country has, how strong the economy is, and whether the government can manage its finances responsibly. If you take away just one thing from this video, it should be this: debt itself isn't the enemy. It's how it's handled that makes all the difference. Now, let's shift our focus just a bit. There's one more question that's often asked. Who holds the most national debt in the world? As of 2025, the United States holds the largest amount of national debt, over $34 trillion. That's more than the entire U.S. economy produces in a year, which puts the debt to GDP ratio over 120%. Japan, meanwhile, has an even higher ratio, over 250%. Yet, Japan hasn't defaulted, and it still maintains a strong economy. How is that possible? It comes down to a few key things: strong institutions, political stability, and most importantly, the fact that most of Japan's debt is held by its own citizens and institutions. This gives it more control over its debt compared to countries that rely heavily on foreign lenders. The lesson here is that not all debt is created equal. A strong, stable economy with responsible leadership can handle more debt than a weak or unstable one. It's not just about the numbers. It's not just about the full picture. So next time you hear people say, "The country is going bankrupt," or "Our debt is out of control," take a moment to look deeper. Ask how the debt is being used. Ask who it's owed to. Ask what the long-term plan is. Those are the real questions that matter. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing for more deep dives like this one. If you're curious about how inflation works or how money is created in the first place, check out the videos linked below. See you next time.